Well, hello, and welcome to For the Living of These Days. 6 minutes late. Uh, Technical difficulties. Change. Transition and adaptability. A theme for this edition of For the Living of These Days, Transition Edition, or Topics for 10 for the Living of These Days. Uh, a transitionary title as we move forward Thursday nights at 7 o'clock. So, just just been contemplating on change and transitions um, and the words of the day of change and transition for the living of these days. Wisdom speaks, and I was led today to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. You've heard these words, they've been sung and pondered, but they do present this transitionary model of life, which we are all evolving, we are all changing, and when we struggle with change and transition. So for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to loose, a time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. So transitions are necessary in life and inevitable, whether we are ready or not, whether we like it or not. Some transitions are painful, some joyous. And we have to know when it is time to evolve. We can get stuck out of fear of change. We can get stale, stagnant. Our thoughts, our mind, our spirit, our body. We can get too comfortable and say, well, I've always done it this way before. We've never done it that way before. In fact, we've never done it that way before. The 7 last words of the church, I think. During this time of COVID, we've had an abrupt change a year ago. Now emerging out of the pandemic, hopefully, yet in parts of our world not emerging. We will be different. We are forever changed, and there is a new season of humanity, of life, even in the midst of the pandemic, where our prayers and our hearts break for India, and also for pockets in our world, in our country, in our communities, where the pandemic is spiking, even in the midst of vaccine. But there is hope. There is hope, even in the midst of despair, because change is inevitable. It is said, but it is said, because in the midst of this change of our lives, I remembered scientific fact is, and coming from discovery.com, I found an answer to that scientific awareness I had from some point in my life. And it goes, but how do you get to know yourself when you are constantly changing is the question. Whether it's shedding skin, renewing the lungs, or growing new hairs, the human body is in constant flux. And this is where I'm going in transition. I mean, our bodies are transition. Our very lives are transition and change. According to researchers, the body replaces itself with a largely new set of cells every 7 to 10 years. Now, there's a jubilee of the body. Some of our most important parts are revamped even more rapidly, says Stanford University. It goes on, to understand how often your cells replace themselves, you need to understand how cells come into being. In the first place, your body can make new cells in a couple of ways. First, existing cells can divide via a fairly simple process called mitosis. During mitosis, a parent cell splits into two new cells, and these new cells, called daughter cells, are basically copies of the original cells. The second way that cells are created is from stem cells. These are special cells found throughout the body. Although in lower numbers, they're able to not only create copies of themselves via mitosis, but also make new specialized cells. Specialized cells include blood cells and nerve cells, which can't make copies of themselves. To control the growth of new cells, old cells also need to die. For example, the spaces between your fingers, toes, are partly due to cell death when you are born. This programmed cell death is required in order to prevent you from having webbed hands and feet. After some time, all cells eventually shrivel and die. With this being said, for the living of these days, we could use and realize that our bodies are constantly changing and renewing itself. How wonderfully and fearfully we are made by our Creator, and that our cells are regenerative, and so for the living of these days, uh, here's a switch in transition. I was thinking, well, in coming out of this pandemic, well, maybe this time on Thursday, we need a makeover. We need to change. I love connecting, and so, but we're coming into uh, a new emergence in our pandemic, and so a change, as this offering was born a year ago as the pandemic began spreading. And it was a sense of just somehow connecting, because we were so isolated and we were so siloed into our homes, locked down. Talk about abrupt change. So the thought of connecting in some simple way was for the living of these days. And in the midst of this now, as vaccines take hold, but our world is still horrifically being attacked by this pandemic. Again, as I said before, in India, our prayers, and it's overwhelming. But we also realize that we are finding new ways to come together, to get out, to safely connect. So in this transition change topic of today, maybe a more very simple, inane level on this time for the living of these days, I just thought everything must have a season, right? So I'll continue these offerings, but I want to keep it to 10 minutes and offer more of a time of topic related, and less musing, right? Because we're getting out, and now we have to transition into how do we connect and reemerge into this world. What is the world that we're reemerging into politically, socially, with such white supremacy and such hatred and such division, but at the same time, such beauty and opportunity and love and healing. So, in the midst of this liminal space, um, even in a small way, I thought, well, we can transition a time, and that I can share more topics specific in 10 minutes, like maybe topics for 10 for the living of these days. You can even share those who are watching, just share on the stream any of your thoughts of what you'd love for me to do. I could go onto the street and I could, interview or encounter the world, right? So the part of this is emergence. This transition is emergence. It's time to get out, and risk safely. in the midst of praying for our world still in flux. Topics for 10 for the living these days might be a nice change. So stay tuned. All this being said, stay tuned as I change up the focus for our time for this Thursday evening, 7 o'clock time, to make it more applicable to emergence, transition, change, and do some of the work to just find ways that we can connect. So stay tuned each Thursday as I change things up a bit, okay? Transition, change. In the midst of all of this, then, we bring this together, bring this home. In the midst of your life, is in the changes and chances of life. We've got a God of changelessness, a God of love that is embedded in the midst of our evolution. And so let us connect to that love is still love, and that we can find ways to emerge into that love for this world, for one another, and show up for each other in new ways. So, in the midst of change and transition can be joyful and painful and all of that. It is resurrection that we seek, life and death. And so it's a part of the human landscapes. And so God bless you, and stay tuned. Find ways of topics for 10. A little jeopardy thrown into the mix. Peace. Thank you for listening, and we'll chat again. Peace.